London British lawmakers were preparing on Tuesday for one of the most critical showdowns of the country's agonising three-year Brexit battle, with Parliament expected to try to stop the government from leaving the European Union without an agreement, a manoeuvre that could prompt a third general election in 4 years. On a day of high drama, one Conservative rebel, Philip Lee, quit the party to join the Liberal Democrats, who have managed to stage a resurgence by positioning themselves as an unambiguously anti-Brexit party, a move that means that Prime Minister Boris Johnson no longer has a working majority in Parliament. The practical effect of Mr. Lee's announcement, and its effect on Mr. Johnson, was limited, however, because the government would fall only if it were defeated in a confidence motion. Lawmakers are expected to try to seize control of events in Parliament, a process that is normally the preserve of the government. Such a move would clear the way for them to force Mr. Johnson to seek an extension to the October 31 Brexit deadline if he fails to reach an exit agreement with the bloc. The clash on Tuesday, as Parliament returned from its summer recess, has been made possible by a faction of lawmakers in Mr. Johnson's own party who have said they will not support a no-deal departure, threatening to defy the Prime Minister's warning that Tory rebels will be expelled from the party if they pursue the parliamentary effort. Mr. Johnson said on Monday that he would refuse to ask the European Union to extend the deadline under any circumstances, meaning that his only option would be to call for a general election, which would be expected to be called for October 14. Speaking to Parliament on Tuesday, Mr. Johnson said that everyone could see that his government was utterly determined to leave the European Union, come what may. The confrontation is the latest chapter in an escalating crisis over Brexit that has divided Britons. It has torn apart the governing Conservative Party, provoked claims that Mr. Johnson is trampling the conventions of Britain's unwritten constitution, and led to accusations that Brexit opponents are trying to circumvent the results of a democratic referendum. Opponents of a no-deal Brexit argue that Mr. Johnson's promise to leave the bloc without a deal would be catastrophic for the British economy. Many experts say it could lead to shortages of food, fuel, and medicine, and wreak havoc on parts of the manufacturing sector that rely on the seamless flow of goods across the English Channel. The confusion surrounding Brexit, and the fears about damage to the British economy if the country leaves without a deal, have taken their toll on the pound. On Tuesday, the currency dropped below $1.20 before bouncing back above that mark later in the day. Despite the threats of a party purge, Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Mr. Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May, said on Tuesday that he would join the efforts to stop a no-deal Brexit, adding that he thought the rebels had enough support for victory. Mr. Hammond also dismissed claims from the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, that opponents of a no-deal Brexit were undermining Mr. Johnson's negotiating strategy in Brussels. There had been, Mr. Hammond told the BBC, no progress in those talks. To add to the turmoil and confusion, the opposition Labour Party said it might thwart Mr. Johnson's attempt to push for a general election, should it come to that. Under a 2011 law, the Prime Minister needs a two-thirds majority in order to secure a snap election. The bitter dispute has taken Britain into new political territory. Last week Mr. Johnson provoked outrage by curtailing Parliament's sessions in September and October, compacting the amount of time lawmakers would have to deal with the most crucial decision the country has faced in decades. Mr. Johnson says he needs to keep the no-deal option on the table to give him leverage in talks in Brussels, because an abrupt exit would also damage continental economies, if not as much as Britain's. On Monday, he said that the rebels were trying to chop the legs from his negotiating position at a time when he is making progress, although the Brexit Secretary, Stephen Barclay, gave a more downbeat assessment of those negotiations. The European Commission said on Tuesday that while the frequency of meetings between its Brexit team and the British negotiator, David Frost, had increased, little headway had been made toward avoiding a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Asked whether the British government was using reports of its talks with the Commission for political purposes at home, the Commission's spokeswoman, Mina Andreeva, said that the body was an honest broker as always, but that she can't report any concrete proposals having been made that we have seen. Mr. Hammond told the BBC on Tuesday that Mr. Johnson's claim of progress on the negotiations was disingenuous. One of the most unlikely of rebels, Mr. Hammond was a senior member of the cabinet 2 months ago, and his downbeat style and focus on economic detail earned him the nickname Spreadsheet Philippines. But he accused his enemies of trying to turn the Conservative Party from a broad church into a narrow faction, and criticized Mr. Johnson's close aide Dominic Cummings. If Mr. Johnson does pursue a general election, Mr. Hammond said he would try to block that push. There is so little trust in British politics that Mr. Johnson's opponents fear that he might request an election for October 14 but then switch the date until after October 31 as part of a move to lock in a no-deal withdrawal. Labour, which has its own polarising leader in Jeremy Corbyn, has said that its priority is to stop Britain leaving the European Union without a deal because of concerns about what such a departure would mean for the economy. But Labour's stance underscores that the backdrop to everything in British politics is a sense that a general election is looming, with key players manoeuvring for the most advantageous moment. Even with the support of 10 lawmakers from Northern Ireland, the government no longer has a working majority in Parliament, a position that cannot be sustained by any administration for long, let alone one facing the challenge of Brexit. Mr. Johnson is trying to unite the political right, particularly Brexit supporters frustrated with Britain's failure to leave the bloc earlier this year. Some Tories fear that they face an existential threat from Nigel Farage's Brexit party, leading to a belief that Mr. Johnson must pursue a no-deal Brexit, whatever the economic cost, to save his party. Others think that the disruption likely to flow from such a rupture would make it impossible for the government to win a vote.